Chapter 28. Nothing occurred during the next 3 or 4 days to make Eleanor regret what she had done in applying to her mother, for Willoughby neither came nor wrote. They were engaged about the end of that time to attend Lady Middleton to a party from which Mrs. Jennings was kept away by the indisposition of her youngest daughter. And for this party, Marianne, wholly dispirited, careless of her appearance, and seeming equally indifferent whether she went or stayed, prepared, without one look of hope or one expression of pleasure. She sat by the drawing-room fire after tea till the moment of Lady Middleton's arrival, without once stirring from her seat or altering her attitude, lost in her own thoughts, and insensible of her sister's presence. And when at last they were told that Lady Middleton waited for him at the door, she started as if she had forgotten that anyone was expected. They arrived in due time at the place of destination, and as soon as the string of carriages before them would allow, alighted, ascended the stairs, heard their names announced from the one landing place to another in an audible voice, and entered a room splendidly lit up, quite full of company, and insufferably hot. When they had paid their tribute of politeness by curtsying to the lady of the house, they were permitted to mingle in the crowd and take their share of the heat and inconvenience, to which their arrival must necessarily add. After some time spent in saying little or doing less, Lady Middleton sat down to casino, and as Marianne was not in the spirits for moving about, she and Eleanor, luckily succeeding to chairs, placed themselves at no great distance from the table. They had not remained in this manner long before Eleanor perceived Willoughby standing within a few yards of him, in earnest conversation with a very fashionable-looking young woman. She soon caught his eye, and he immediately bowed, but without attempting to speak to her or approach Marianne, though he could not but see her, and then continued his discourse with the same lady. Eleanor turned involuntarily to Marianne to see whether it could be unobserved by her. At that moment she first perceived him, and her whole countenance glowing with sudden delight, she would have moved towards him instantly had not her sister caught hold of him. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed. He's there! He's there! Oh, why does he not look at me? Why cannot I speak to him?" Pray, be composed," cried Eleanor, "and don't betray what you feel to everybody present. Perhaps he has not observed you yet." This, however, was more than she could believe herself, and to be composed at such a moment was not only beyond the reach of Marianne, it was beyond her wish. She sat in agony of impatience, which affected every feature. At last he turned round again and regarded them both. She started up, and pronouncing his name in a tone of affection, held out her hand to him. He approached, and addressing himself rather to Eleanor than Marianne, as if wishing to avoid her eye, and determined not to observe her attitude, inquired in a hurried manner after Mrs. Dashwood, and asked how long they had been in town. Eleanor was robbed of all presence of mind by such an address, and was unable to say a word, but the feelings of her sister were instantly expressed. Her face was crimsoned over, and she exclaimed in a voice of the greatest emotion, "Good God, Willoughby, what's the meaning of this? Have you not received my letters? Will you not shake hands with me?" He could not then avoid it, but her touch seemed painful to him, and he held her hand only for a moment. During all this time he was evidently struggling for composure. Eleanor watched his countenance, and saw its expression becoming more tranquil. After a moment's pause, he broke with calmness. "I did myself the honor of calling in Berkeley Street last Tuesday, and very much regretted that I was not fortunate enough to find yourselves and Mrs. Jennings at home. My card was not lost, I hope." "But have you not received my notes?" cried Marianne in the wildest anxiety. Here's some mistake, I'm sure, some dreadful mistake. What can be the meaning of it? Tell me, Willoughby, for heaven's sake, tell me what's the matter." He made no reply. His complexion changed, and his embarrassment returned. But as if, on catching the eye of the young lady with whom he had been previously talking, he felt the necessity of instant exertion. He recovered himself again, and after saying, "Yes, I had the pleasure of receiving the information of your arrival in town, which you were so good as to send me," turned hastily away with a slight bow, and joined his friend. Marianne, now looking dreadfully white and unable to stand, sunk into her chair, and Eleanor, expecting every moment to see her faint, tried to screen her from the observation of others, while reviving her with lavender water. "Go to him, Eleanor," she cried, as soon as she could speak, "and force him to come to me. Tell him I must see him again, must speak to him instantly. I cannot rest. I shall not have a moment's peace till this is explained, some dreadful misapprehension or other. Oh, go to him this moment." "How can that be done? No, my dearest Marianne, you must wait. This is not the place for explanations. Wait only till tomorrow." With difficulty, however, could she prevent her from following him herself, and persuade her to check her agitation, to wait at least with the appearance of composure till she might speak with him with more privacy and more effect, was impossible. For Marianne continued incessantly to give way in a low voice to the misery of her feelings by exclamations of wretchedness. In a short time, Eleanor saw Willoughby quit the room by the door towards the staircase, and telling Marianne that he was gone, urged the impossibility of speaking to him again that evening, as a fresh argument for her to be calm. She instantly begged her sister would entreat Lady Middleton to take him home, as she was too miserable to stay a minute longer. Lady Middleton, though in the middle of a rubber, on being informed that Marianne was unwell, was too polite to object for a moment to her wish of going away, and making over her cards to a friend, they departed as soon as the carriage could be found. Scarcely a word was spoken during their return to Berkeley Street. Marianne was in a silent agony, too much oppressed even for tears. But as Mrs. Jennings was luckily not come home, they could go directly to their own room, where Hartshorn restored her a little to herself. She was soon undressed and in bed, and as she seemed desirous of being alone, her sister then left her, and while she waited for the return of Mrs. Jennings, had leisure enough for thinking over the past. That some kind of engagement had subsisted between Willoughby and Marianne she could not doubt, and that Willoughby was weary of it seemed equally clear. For however Marianne might still feed her own wishes, she could not attribute such behavior to mistake or misapprehension of any kind. Nothing but a thorough change of sentiment could account for it. Her indignation would have still been stronger than it was had she not witnessed that embarrassment which seemed to speak a consciousness of his own misconduct, and prevent her from believing him so unprincipled as to have been sporting with the affections of her sister from the first, without any design that would bear investigation. Absence might have weakened his regard, and convenience might have determined him to overcome it, but that such a regard had formerly existed she could not bring herself to doubt. As for Marianne, on the pangs which so unhappy a meeting must already have given her, and on those still more severe which might await her in its probable consequence, she could not reflect without the deepest concern. Her own situation gained in the comparison, for while she could esteem Edward as much as ever, however they might be divided in future, her mind might be always supported. But every circumstance that could embitter such an evil seemed uniting to heighten the misery of Marianne in a final separation from Willoughby, in an immediate and irreconcilable rupture with him. Chapter 29. Before the housemaid had lit their fire the next day, or the sun gained any power over a cold, gloomy morning in January, Marianne, only half dressed, was kneeling against one of the window seats, for the sake of all the little light she could command from it, and writing as fast as a continual flow of tears would permit her. In this situation, Eleanor, roused from sleep by her agitation and sobs, first perceived her, and after observing her for a few moments with silent anxiety, said, in a tone of the most considerate gentleness, "Marianne, may I ask—" "No, Eleanor," she replied. "Ask nothing. You will soon know all." The sort of desperate calmness with which this was said lasted no longer than while she spoke, and was immediately followed by a return of the same excessive affliction. It was some moments before she could go on with her letter, and the frequent bursts of grief which still obliged her at intervals to withhold her pen were proofs enough of her feeling how more than probable it was that she was writing for the last time to Willoughby. Eleanor paid her every quiet and unobtrusive attention in her power, and she would have tried to soothe and tranquilize her still more had not Marianne entreated her, with all the eagerness of the most nervous irritability, not to speak to her for the world. In such circumstances it was better for both that they should not be long together, and the restless state of Marianne's mind not only prevented her from remaining in the room a moment after she was dressed, but requiring at once solitude and continual change of place, and made her wander about the house till breakfast time, avoiding the sight of everybody. At breakfast she neither ate nor attempted to eat anything, and Eleanor's attention was then all employed, not in urging her, not in pitying her, nor in appearing to regard her, but in endeavoring to engage Mrs. Jennings' notice entirely to herself. As this was a favorite meal with Mrs. Jennings, it lasted a considerable time, and they were just setting themselves after it round the common working table when a letter was delivered to Mary Ann, which she eagerly caught from the servant, and, turning of a death-like paleness, instantly ran out of the room. Eleanor, who saw as plainly by this as if she had seen the direction that it must come from Willoughby, felt immediately such a sickness at heart as made her hardly able to hold up her head, and sat in such a general tremor as made her fear it impossible to escape Mrs. Jennings' notice. That good lady, however, saw only that Mary Ann had received a letter from Willoughby, which appeared to her a very good joke, and which she treated accordingly by hoping, with a laugh, that she would find it to her liking. Of Eleanor's distress, she was too busily employed in measuring lengths of worsted for a rug to see anything at all, and calmly continuing her talk, as soon as Mary Ann disappeared, she said, "Upon my word, I never saw a young woman so desperately in love in all my life. My girls were nothing to her, and yet they used to be foolish enough. But as for Miss Mary Ann, she's quite an altered creature. I hope from the bottom of my heart he won't keep her waiting much longer, for it's quite grievous to look at her so ill and forlorn. Pray, when are they to be married?" Eleanor, though never less disposed to speak than at that moment, obliged herself to answer such an attack as this, and therefore, trying to smile, replied, "And have you really, ma'am, talked yourself into a persuasion of my sister's being engaged to Mr. Willoughby? I thought it had only been a joke, but so serious a question seems to imply more, and I must beg, therefore, that you will not deceive yourself any longer. I do assure you that nothing would surprise me more than to hear of their being good to be married." For shame, Miss Dashwood, how can you talk so? Don't we all know that it must be a match, that they were head over ears in love with each other from the very first moment they met? Did not I see 'em together in Devonshire every day and all day long? And did not I know that your sister came to town with me on the purpose to buy wedding clothes? Come, this won't do. Besides, you're so sly about it yourself, you think nobody else has any senses. But it's no such thing, I can tell you, for it's been known all over town this ever so long. I tell everybody of it, and so does Charlotte. "Indeed, ma'am," said Eleanor very seriously, "you are mistaken. Indeed, you are doing a very unkind thing in spreading the report, and you will soon find that you have, though you will not believe me now." Mrs. Jennings laughed again, but Eleanor had not spirits to say more, and eager at all events to know what Willoughby had written, hurried away to their room, where, on opening the door, she saw Mary Ann stretched on the bed, almost choked by grief, one letter in her hand, and two or three others laying by her. Eleanor drew near, but without saying a word, and seating herself on the bed, took her hand, kissed her affectionately several times, then gave way to a burst of tears, which at first was scarcely less violent than Mary Ann's. The latter, though unable to speak, seemed to feel all the tenderness of this behavior, and after some time thus spent in joint affliction, she put all the letters in Eleanor's hands, and then, covering her face with her handkerchief, almost screamed with agony. Eleanor, who knew that such grief, shocking as it was to witness, must have its course, watched by till this excess of suffering had somewhat spent itself, and then, turning eagerly to Willoughby's letter, read as follows: "Bond Street, January. My dear Madam, I have just had the honor of receiving your letter, for which I beg to return my sincere acknowledgments. I am much concerned to find that there was anything in my behavior last night that did not meet your approbation, and though I am quite at a loss to discover at what point I could be so unfortunate as to offend you, I entreat your forgiveness of what I can assure you to have been perfectly unintentional. I shall never reflect on my former acquaintance with your family in Devonshire without the most grateful pleasure, and flatter myself it will not be broken by any mistake or misapprehensions of my actions. My esteem for your whole family is very sincere, but if I have been so unfortunate as to give rise to a belief of more than I felt, I shall reproach myself for not having been more guarded in my professions of that esteem. That I should ever have meant more you will allow to be impossible, when you understand that my affections have been long engaged elsewhere, and it will not be many weeks, I believe, before this engagement is fulfilled. It's with great regret that I obey your commands in returning the letters which I have been honored from you, and the lock of your hair which you so obligingly bestowed on me. I am, dear madam, your most obedient, humble servant, John Willoughby." With what indignation such a letter as this must be read by Miss Dashwood may be imagined. Though aware, before she began it, that it must bring a confession of his inconstancy and confirm their separation forever, she was not aware that such language could be suffered to announce it, nor could she have supposed Willoughby capable of departing so far from the appearance of every honourable and delicate feeling, so far from the common decorum of a gentleman, as to send a letter so impudently cruel. A letter which, instead of bringing with his desire of a release of professions of regret, acknowledged no breach of faith, denied all peculiar affection whatever, a letter of which every line was an insult, and which proclaimed its writer to be deep in hardened villainy. She paused over it for some time with indignant astonishment, then read it again and again. But every perusal only served to increase her abhorrence of the man, and so bitter were her feelings against him that she dared not trust herself to speak, lest she might wound Marianne still deeper by treating their disengagement, not as a loss to her of any possible good, but as an escape from the worst and most irremediable of all evils, a connection for life with an unprincipled man, as a deliverance the most real, a blessing the most important. In her earnest meditations on the contents of the letter, on the depravity of that mind which could dictate it, and probably on the very different mind of a very different person, who had no other connection whatever with the affair than what her heart gave him with everything that passed, Elinor forgot the immediate distress of her sister, forgot that she had 3 letters on her lap yet unread, and so entirely forgot how long she had been in the room, that when on hearing a carriage drive up to the door, she went to the window to see who could be coming so unreasonably early, and she was all astonishment to perceive Mrs. Jennings' chariot, which she knew had not been ordered till 1. Determined not to quit Marianne, though hopeless of contributing at present to her ease, she hurried away to excuse herself from attending Mrs. Jennings on account of her sister being indisposed. Mrs. Jennings, with a thoroughly good-humoured concern for its cause, admitted the excuse most readily, and Elinor, after seeing her safe off, returned to Marianne, whom she found attempting to rise from the bed, and whom she reached just in time to prevent her from falling on the floor, faint and giddy from a long want of proper rest and food. For it was many days since she had any appetite, and many nights since she had really slept. And now, when her mind was no longer supported by the fever of suspense, the consequence of all this was felt in an aching head, a weakened stomach, and a general nervous faintness. A glass of wine, which Elinor procured for her directly, made her more comfortable, and she was at last able to express some sense of her kindness by saying, "Poor Elinor, how unhappy I make you." "I only wish," replied her sister, "there were anything I could do which might be of comfort to you." This, as everything else would have been, was too much for Marianne, who could only exclaim, in the anguish of her heart, "Oh, Elinor, I am miserable indeed," before her voice was entirely lost in sobs. Elinor could no longer witness this torrent of unresisted grief in silence. "Exert yourself, dear Marianne," she cried. "If you would not kill yourself and all who love you, think of your mother, think of her misery while you suffer. For her sake you must exert yourself." I cannot, cried Marianne. Leave me if I distress you. Leave me, hate me, forget me, but do not torture me so. Oh, how easy for those who have no sorrow of their own to talk of exertion. Happy, happy Elinor, you can't have an idea of what I suffer. Do you call me happy, Marianne? Oh, if you knew. And can you believe me to be so, while I see you so wretched? Forgive me, throwing her arms around her sister's neck. I know you feel for me. I know what a heart you have. But yet you must be happy. Edward loves you. What can do away with such happiness as that? Many, many circumstances, said Elinor solemnly. No, 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 cried Marianne wildly. He loves you and only you. You can have no grief. I can have no pleasure while I see you in this state. And you'll never see me otherwise. Mine is a misery which nothing can do away. You must not talk so, Marianne. Have you no comforts, no friends? Is your loss such as leaves no opening for consolation? Think of what you would have suffered if the discovery of his character had been delayed to a later period, if your engagement had been carried on for months and months, as it might have been, before he chose to put an end to it. Every additional day of unhappy confidence on your side would have made the blow more dreadful. Engagement, cried Marianne. There's been no engagement. No engagement? No, he is not so unworthy as you believe him. He has broken no faith with me. But he told you that he loved you. Yes, no, never absolutely. It was every day implied, but never professedly declared. Sometimes I thought it had been, but it never was. Yet you wrote to him. Yes, could that be wrong after all that had passed? But I can't talk. Eleanor said no more, and turning again to the 3 letters, which now raised a much stronger curiosity than before, directly ran over the contents of all. The first, which was what her sister had sent him on their first arrival into town, was to this effect: Berkeley Street, January. How surprised you'll be, Willoughby, on receiving this, and I think you'll feel something more than surprise when you know that I'm in town. An opportunity of coming hither, though with Mrs. Jennings, was a temptation we could not resist. I wish you may receive this in time to come here tonight, but I will not depend on it. At any rate, I shall expect you tomorrow. For the present, adieu, M.D. Her second note, which had been written on the morning after the dance at the Middletons, was in these words: I cannot express my disappointment in having missed you the day before yesterday, nor my astonishment at not having received any answer to a note which I sent you above a week ago. I've been expecting to hear from you, and still more to see you every hour of the day. Pray call again as soon as possible, and explain the reason of my having expected this in vain. You'd better come earlier another time, because we are generally out by 1. We were last night at Lady Middleton's, where there was a dance. I've been told that you were asked to be of the party, but could it be so? You must be very much altered indeed since we parted, if that should be the case and you were not there. But I will not suppose this possible, and I hope very soon to receive your personal assurance of its being otherwise. M.D. The contents of her last note to him were these: What am I to imagine, Willoughby, by your behavior last night? Again, I demand an explanation of it. I was prepared to meet you with the pleasure which our separation naturally produced, with the familiarity which our intimacy at Barton appeared to me to justify. I was repulsed indeed. I have passed a wretched night in endeavoring to excuse a conduct which can scarcely be called less than insulting. But though I have not yet been able to form any reasonable apology for your behavior, I'm perfectly ready to hear your justification of it. You have perhaps been misinformed or purposely deceived in something concerning me, which may have lowered me in your opinion. Tell me what it is, explain the grounds on which you acted, and I shall be satisfied in being able to satisfy you. It would grieve me indeed to be obliged to think ill of you. But if I am to do it, if I am to learn that you are not what we have hitherto believed you, that your regard for us all was insincere, that your behavior to me was intended only to deceive, let it be told as soon as possible. My feelings are at present in a state of dreadful indecision. I wish to acquit you, but certainly on either side will be ease to what I now suffer. If your sentiments are no longer what they were, you will return my notes and the lock of my hair which is in your possession. M.D. That such letters, so full of affection and confidence, could have been so answered, Eleanor, for Willoughby's sake, would have been unwilling to believe. But her condemnation of them did not blind her to the impropriety of their having been written at all, and she was silently grieving over the imprudence which had hazarded such unsolicited proofs of tenderness, not warranted by anything preceding, and most severely condemned by the event, when Marianne, perceiving that she had finished the letters, observed to her that they contained nothing by which any one would have written in the same situation. I felt myself, she added, to be as solemnly engaged to him as if the strictest legal covenant had bound us to each other. I can believe it, said Eleanor, but unfortunately he did not feel the same. He did feel the same, Eleanor. For weeks and weeks he felt it. I know he did. Whatever may have changed him now, and nothing but the blackest art employed against me could have done it, I was once as dear to him as my own soul could wish. This lock of hair, which he can so readily give up, was begged of me with the most earnest supplication. Had you seen his look, his manner, had you heard his voice at that moment, have you forgot the evening of our last being together at Barton, the morning that we parted too, when he told me that it might be many weeks before we met again? His distress, can I ever forget his distress? For a moment or two she could say no more, but when this emotion had passed away, she added in a firmer tone, Eleanor, I have been cruelly used, but not by Willoughby. Dearest Marianne, who but himself? By whom can he have been instigated? By all the world rather than by his own heart. I could rather believe every creature of my acquaintance leagued together to ruin me in his opinion than believe his nature capable of such cruelty. This woman of whom he writes, whoever she may be, or anyone, in short, but your own dear self, Mamma, and Edward, may have been so barbarous to belie me. Beyond you three, is there a creature in the world whom I would not rather suspect of evil than Willoughby, whose heart I know so well? Eleanor would not contend, and only replied, whoever may have been so detestably your enemy, let him be cheated of their malignant triumph, my dear sister, by seeing how nobly the consciousness of your own innocence and good intentions supports your spirits. It's a reasonable and laudable pride which resists such malevolence. No, no, cried Marianne. Misery such as mine has no pride. I care not who knows that I am wretched. The triumph of seeing me so may be open to all the world. Eleanor, they who suffer little may be proud and independent as they like, may resist insult or return mortification, but I cannot. I must feel, I must be wretched, and they are welcome to enjoy the consciousness of it that can. But for my mother's sake and mine, I would do no more than for my own, but to appear happy when I'm miserable, oh, who can require it? Again they were both silent. Eleanor was employed in walking thoughtfully from the fire to the window, from the window to the fire, without knowing that she received warmth from one or discerning objects through the other. And Marianne, seated at the foot of the bed, and her head leaning against one of its posts, again took up Willoughby's letter, and after shuddering over every sentence, exclaimed, it's too much. Oh, Willoughby, Willoughby, could this be yours? Cruel, cruel, nothing can acquit you. Eleanor, nothing can. Whatever he might have heard against me, ought he not to have suspended his belief? Ought he not to have told me of it, and to have given me the power of clearing myself? The lock of hair, repeating it from the letter, which you so obligingly bestowed on me, that is unpardonable. Willoughby, where was your heart when you wrote those words? Oh, barbarously insolent! Eleanor, can he be justified? No, Marianne, in no possible way. And yet this woman, who knows what her art may have been, how long it may have been premeditated, and how deeply contrived by her? Who is she? Who can she be? Whom did I ever hear him talk of as young and attractive among his female acquaintance? No one, no one. He talked to me only of myself. Another pause ensued. Marianne was greatly agitated, and it ended thus. Eleanor, I must go home. I must go and comfort Mamma. Cannot we be gone tomorrow? Tomorrow, Marianne? Yes, why should I stay here? I came only for Willoughby's sake, and now who cares for me? Who regards me? It would be impossible to go tomorrow. We owe Mrs. Jennings much more than civility, and civility of the commonest kind must prevent such a hasty removal as that. Well, then, another day or two, perhaps, but I can't stay here long. I cannot stay to endure the questions and remarks of all these people, the Middletons and Palmers. How am I to bear their pity, the pity of such a woman as Lady Middleton? Oh, what would he say to that? Eleanor advised her to lie down again, and for a moment she did so, but no attitude could give her ease, and in restless pain of mind and body she moved from one posture to another, till growing more and more hysterical, her sister could with difficulty keep her on the bed at all, and for some time she was fearful of being constrained to call for assistance. Some lavender drops, however, which she was at length persuaded to take, were of use, and from that time till Mrs. Jennings returned, she continued on the bed, quiet and motionless. Chapter 30. Mrs. Jennings came immediately to their room on her return, and without waiting to have her request of admittance answered, opened the door and walked in with a look of real concern. "How do you do, my dear?" she said in a voice of great compassion to Marianne, who turned away her face without attempting to answer. "How is she, Miss Dashwood, poor thing? She looks very bad. No wonder. Ah, but it's true. He's to be married very soon. A good-for-nothing fellow. I have no patience with him. Mrs. Taylor told me of it half an hour ago, and she was told to it by a particular friend of Miss Grey herself, else I am sure I would not have believed it, and I was almost ready to sink as it was. Well, says I, all I can say is, that if this be true, he has used a young lady of my acquaintance abominably ill, and I wish with all my soul his wife may plague his heart out. And so I shall always say, my dear, you may depend on it. I have no notion of men's going on in this way, and if ever I meet him again, I will give him such a dressing as he's not had in many a day. But there's one comfort, my dear Miss Marianne, he's not the only man in the world worth having. And with your pretty face, you'll never want admirers. Well, poor thing, I won't disturb her any longer, for she had better have her cry out at once and have it done with. The Pears and Sandersons luckily are coming tonight, and that'll amuse her. She then went away, walking on tiptoe out of the room as if she supposed her young friend's affliction could be increased by noise. Mary Ann, to the surprise of her sister, determined on dining with them. Eleanor even advised her against it, but no, she would go down, she could bear it very well, and the bustle about her would be less. Eleanor, pleased to have her governed for a moment by such a motive, though believing it hardly possible that she could sit out the dinner, said no more, and adjusting her dress for her as well as she could, while Mary Ann still remained on the bed, was ready to assist her into the dining room as soon as they were summoned to it. When there, though looking most wretchedly, she ate more and was calmer than her sister had expected. Had she tried to speak, or had she been conscious of half Mrs. Jennings' well-meant but ill-judged attentions to her, this calmness could not have been maintained. But not a syllable escaped her lips, and the abstraction of her thoughts preserved her in ignorance of everything that was passing before her. Eleanor, who did justice to Mrs. Jennings' kindness, though its effusions were often distressing, and sometimes almost ridiculous, made her those acknowledgments, and returned her those civilities which her sister could not make or return for herself. Their good friend saw that Mary Ann was unhappy, and felt that everything was due to her which might make her at all less so. She treated her, therefore, with all the indulgent fondness of a parent towards a favorite child on the last day of its holidays. Mary Ann was to have the best place by the fire, was to be tempted to eat by every delicacy in the house, and to be amused by the relation of all the news of the day. Had not Eleanor, in the sad countenance of her sister, seen a check to all mirth, she could have been entertained by Mrs. Jennings' endeavors to a cure of disappointment in love by a variety of sweetmeats and olives and a good fire. As soon, however, as the consciousness of all this was forced by continual repetition on Mary Ann, she could stay no longer. With a hasty exclamation of misery and a sign to her sister not to follow her, she directly got up and hurried out of the room. "Poor soul!" cried Mrs. Jennings as soon as she was gone. "How it grieves me to see her, and I declare if she's not gone away without finishing her wine. And the dried cherries, too. Lord, nothing seems to do her any good. I'm sure if I knew of anything she would like, I would send all over town for it. Well, it is the oddest thing to me that a man should use such a pretty girl so ill. But when there's plenty of money on one side and next to none on the other, Lord bless you, they can care no more about such things." "The lady, then, Miss Gray, I think you called her, is very rich?" £50,000, my dear. Did you ever see her? A smart, stylish girl, they say, but not handsome. I remember her aunt very well. She married a very wealthy man, but the family are all rich together. £50,000, and by all account, it won't come before it's wanted, for they say he is all to pieces. No wonder, dashing about with his curricle and hunters. Well, it don't signify talking, but when a young man, be who he will, comes and makes love to a pretty girl and promises marriage, he has no business to fly off from his word only because he grows poor and a richer girl's ready to have him. Why don't he, in such a case, sell his horses, let his house, turn off his servants, and make a thorough reform at once? I'll warrant you Miss Mary Ann would have been ready to wait till matters came round, but that won't do nowadays. Nothing in the way of pleasure can ever be given up by the young men of this age." "Do you know what kind of a girl Miss Gray is? Is she said to be amiable?" "I never heard any harm of her. Indeed, I hardly ever heard her mentioned, except that Mrs. Taylor did say this morning that one day Miss Walker hinted to her that she believed Mr. and Mrs. Ellison would not be sorry to have Mrs. Gray married, for she and Mrs. Ellison would never agree." "And who are the Ellisons?" "Her guardians, my dear. But now she is of age and may choose for herself, and a pretty choice she's made. What now?" after pausing for a moment. "Your poor sister's gone to her own room, I suppose, to moan by herself. Is there nothing one can get to comfort her? Poor dear, it seems quite cruel to let her be alone. Well, by and by we shall have a few friends, and that'll amuse her a little. What shall we play at? She hates whist, I know, but is there no round game she cares for?" "Dear ma'am, this kindness is quite unnecessary. Mary Ann, I dare say, will not leave her room again this evening. I shall persuade her, if I can, to go early to bed, for I'm sure she wants to rest." Oh, I believe that'll be best for her. Let her name her own supper and go to bed. Lord, no wonder she's been looking so bad and so downcast this last week or two. For this matter, I suppose, has been hanging over her head as long as that. And so the letter that came today finished it. Poor soul, I'm sure if I had a notion of it, I would not have joked her about it for all my money. But then, how should I guess such a thing? I made sure of its being nothing but a common love letter, and young people like to be laughed at about 'em. Lord, how concerned Sir John and my daughters will be when they hear it. If I had any senses about me, I might have called in Conduit Street on my way home and told 'em of it, but I'll see 'em tomorrow. It would be unnecessary, I'm sure, for you to caution Mrs. Palmer and Sir John against ever naming Mr. Willoughby or making the slightest allusion to what has passed before my sister. Their own good nature must point out to them the real cruelty of appearing to know anything about when she's present, and the less that may ever be said to myself on the subject, the more my feelings will be spared, as you, my dear madam, will easily believe. Oh, Lord, yes, that I do believe. It must be terrible for you to hear it talked of, and as your sister, I'm sure I would not mention a word about it to her for the world. You saw I didn't at dinner time. No more would Sir John, nor my daughters, for they're all very thoughtful and considerate, especially if I give 'em a hint, as I certainly will. For my part, I think the less that's said about such things, the better. The sooner 'tis blown over and forgot. And what does talking over ever do? In this affair, it can only do harm, more so perhaps than in many cases of a similar kind, for it has been attended by circumstances which, for the sake of everyone concerned in it, make it unfit to become the public conversation. I must do this justice to Mr. Willoughby. He has broken no positive engagement with my sister. Law, my dear, don't pretend to defend him. No positive engagement indeed. After taking her all over Allenham House and fixing on bare rooms they were to live in hereafter. Eleanor, for her sister's sake, could not press the subject farther, and she hoped it was not required of her for Willoughby's, since though Marianne might lose much, he could gain very little by the enforcement of the real truth. After a short silence on both sides, Mrs. Jennings, with all her natural hilarity, burst forth. Well, my dear, 'tis a true saying about a ill wind, for it'll be all the better for Colonel Brandon. He may have her at last. And that he will. Mind me now, if they aren't married by midsummer. Lord, how he'll chuckle over this news. I hope he'll come tonight. It'll be all to one a better match for your sister. 2,000 a year without debt or drawback, except the little love child. Indeed, I forgot her, but she may be prenticed out at a small cost, and then what does it signify? Delaford's a nice place, I can tell you. Exactly what I call a nice old-fashioned place, full of comforts and conveniences, quite shut in with great garden walls that are covered with the best fruit trees in the country, and such a mulberry tree in one corner. Lord, how Charlotte and I did stuff the only time we were there. Then there's a dovecote, some slightly stew ponds, and a very pretty canal. And everything, in short, that one could wish for. And moreover, it's close to the church, and only a quarter of a mile from the turnpike road, so 'tis never dull. For you only go and sit up in an old yew arbor behind the house, and you may see the carriages that pass along. For if you only go up and sit in the old yew arbor behind the house, you may see all the carriages that pass along. Oh, 'tis a nice place. A butcher hard by in the village, and the parsonage house within a stone's throw. To my fancy, 1,000 times prettier than Barton Park, where they're forced to send 3 miles for their meat, and have not a neighbor nearer than your mother. Well, I shall spirit up the colonel as soon as I can. One shoulder of mutton, drives another down. It cannot but put Willoughby out of her head. Ay, if we can do that, madam, said Eleanor, we shall do very well with or without Colonel Brandon. And then rising, she went away to join Marianne, whom she found, as she expected, in her own room, leaning in silent misery over the small remains of a fire, which, till Eleanor's entrance, had been her only light. You better leave me, was all the notice that her sister received from her. I will leave you, said Eleanor, if you'll go to bed. But this, from the momentary perverseness of impatient suffering, she at first refused to do. Her sister's earnest, though gentle persuasion, however, soon softened her to compliance, and Eleanor saw her lay her aching head on the pillow, and, as she hoped, in a way to get some quiet rest before she left her. In the drawing-room, whither she then repaired, she was soon joined by Mrs. Jennings, with a wine-glass full of something in her hand. My dear, said she, entering, I have just recollected that I have some of the finest old Constantia wine in the house that was ever tasted, so I have brought a glass of it for your sister. My poor husband, how fond he was of it. Whenever he had a touch of his old colicky gout, he said it did him more good than anything else in the world. Do take it to your sister. Dear ma'am, said Eleanor, smiling at the difference of the complaints for which it was recommended, how good you are, but I've just left Marianne to bed, and I hope almost asleep. And as I think nothing will be of much service to her as rest, if you'll give me leave, I'll drink the wine myself. Mrs. Jennings, though regretting she had not been 5 minutes earlier, was satisfied with the compromise, and Eleanor, as she swallowed the chief of it, reflected that though its effects on a colicky gout were at present of little importance to her, its healing powers on a disappointed heart might be as reasonably tried on herself as on her sister. Colonel Brandon came in while the party were at tea, and by his manner of looking around the room for Marianne, Eleanor immediately fancied that he neither expected nor wished to see her there, and in short, that he was already aware of what occasioned her absence. Mrs. Jennings was not struck by the same thought, for soon after his entrance she walked across the room to the tea table where Eleanor presided and whispered, "The colonel looks as grave as ever you see. He knows nothing of it. Do tell him, my dear." He shortly afterwards drew a chair close to hers, and with a look which perfectly assured her of his good information, inquired after her sister. "Marianne is not well," said she. "She has been indisposed all day, and we have persuaded her to go to bed." "Perhaps, then," he hesitatingly replied, "what I heard this morning may be, there may be more truth in it than I could believe possible at first." "What did you hear?" "That a gentleman whom I had reason to think, in short, that a man whom I knew to be engaged, but how shall I tell you? If you know about it already, as surely you must, I may be spared." "You mean," answered Eleanor with forced calmness, "Mr. Willoughby's marriage to Miss Grey? Yes, we do know it all. This seems to have been a day of general elucidation, for this very morning first unfolded it to us. Mr. Willoughby is unfathomable. Where did you hear it?" "In a stationer's shop in Pall Mall where I had business. Two ladies were waiting for their carriage, and one of them was giving the other an account of the intended match in a voice so little attempting concealment that it was impossible for me not to hear it all. The name of Willoughby, John Willoughby, frequently repeated, first caught my attention, and what followed was a positive assertion that everything was now finally settled respecting his marriage with Miss Grey. It was no longer to be a secret. It would take place even within a few weeks, with many particulars of preparations and other matters. One thing especially I remember, because it served to identify the man still more. As soon as the ceremony was over, they were to go to Combe Magna, his seat in Somersetshire. My astonishment, but it would be impossible to describe what I felt. The communicative lady I learnt on inquiry, for I stayed in the shop till they were gone, was a Mrs. Ellison, and that, as I have since been informed, is the name of Miss Grey's guardian." "It is. But you have likewise heard that Miss Grey has £50,000? In that, if anything, we may find an explanation." "Well, it may be so, but Willoughby's capable, at least I think." He stopped for a moment, then added, in a voice which seemed to distrust itself, "And your sister, how's she?" "Her sufferings have been very severe. I have only to hope that they may be proportionately short. It is a most cruel affliction. Till yesterday, I believed she never doubted his regard, and even now, perhaps, but I'm almost convinced that he never was really attached to her. He has been very deceitful, and in some points there seems a hardness of heart about him." "Ah," said Colonel Brandon, "there is indeed. But your sister does not, I think you said so, she does not consider quite as you do. You know her disposition, and may believe how eagerly she would still justify him if she could." He made no answer, but soon afterwards, by the removal of the tea things and the arrangement of the card parties, the subject was necessarily dropped. Mrs. Jennings, who had watched them with pleasure while they were talking, and who expected to see the effect of Miss Dashwood's communication in such an instantaneous gaiety on Colonel Brandon's side as might have become a man in the bloom of youth, of hope and happiness, saw him with amazement, remain the whole evening more serious and thoughtful than usual. Chapter 31. From a night of more sleep than she had expected, Marianne awoke the next morning to the same consciousness of misery in which she had closed her eyes. Eleanor encouraged her as much as possible to talk of what she felt, and before breakfast was ready, they had gone through the subject again and again, and with the same steady conviction and affectionate counsel on Eleanor's side, the same impetuous feelings and varying opinions on Marianne's as before. Sometimes she could believe Willoughby to be as unfortunate and as innocent as herself, and at others lost every consolation in the impossibility of acquitting him. At one moment she was absolutely indifferent to the observation of all the world. At another she would seclude herself from it forever, and at a third could resist it with energy. In one thing, however, she was uniform. When it came to the point, in avoiding, where it was possible, the presence of Mrs. Jennings, and in a determined silence when obliged to endure it. Her heart was hardened against the belief of Mrs. Jennings entering into her sorrows with any compassion. "No, no, no, it cannot be," she cried. "She cannot feel. Her kindness is not sympathy. Her good nature is not tenderness. All that she wants is gossip, and she only likes me now because I can supply it." Eleanor had not needed this to be assured of the injustice to which her sister was often led in her opinion of others, by the irritable refinement of her own mind, and the too great importance placed by her on the delicacies of a strong sensibility and the graces of a polished manner. Like half the rest of the world, if more than half there be are clever and good, Marianne, with excellent abilities and an excellent disposition, was neither reasonable nor candid. She expected from other people the same opinions and feelings as her own, and she judged of their motives by the immediate effect of their actions on herself. Thus a circumstance occurred while the sisters were together in their own room after breakfast, which sunk the heart of Mrs. Jennings still lower in her estimation, because, through her own weakness, it chanced to prove a source of fresh pain to herself, though Mrs. Jennings was governed in it by an impulse of the utmost goodwill. With a letter in her outstretched hand, and countenance gaily smiling from the persuasion of bringing comfort, she entered their room, saying, "Now, my dear, I bring you something that I am sure will do you good." Marianne heard enough. In one moment her imagination placed before her a letter from Willoughby, full of tenderness and contrition, explanatory of all that had passed, satisfactory, convincing, and instantly followed by Willoughby himself, rushing eagerly into the room to enforce at her feet, by the eloquence of his eyes, the assurances of his letter. The work of one moment was destroyed by the next. The handwriting of her mother, never till then unwelcome, was before her, and in the acuteness of the disappointment which followed such an ecstasy of more than hope, she felt as if till that instant she had never suffered. The cruelty of Mrs. Jennings no language within her reach in her moments of happiest eloquence could have expressed, and now she could reproach her only by the tears which streamed from her eyes with passionate violence, a reproach, however, so entirely lost on its subject that after many expressions of pity she withdrew, still referring her to the letter of comfort. But the letter, when she was calm enough to read it, brought little comfort. Willoughby filled every page. Her mother, still confident of their engagement, and relying as warmly as ever on his constancy, had only been roused by Eleanor's application to entreat from Marianne greater openness towards them both, and this with such tenderness towards her, such affection for Willoughby, and such a conviction of their future happiness in each other, that she wept with agony through the whole of it. All her impatience to be at home again now returned. Her mother was dearer to her than ever, dearer through the very excess of her mistaken confidence in Willoughby, and she was wildly urgent to be gone. Eleanor, unable herself to determine whether it were better for Marianne to be in London or at Barton, offered no counsel of her own except of patience till their mother's wishes could be known, and at length she obtained her sister's consent to wait for that knowledge. Mrs. Jennings left them earlier than usual, for she could not be easy till the Middletons and Palmers were able to grieve as much as herself, and positively refusing Eleanor's offered attendance, went out alone for the rest of the morning. Eleanor, with a very heavy heart, aware of the pain she was going to communicate, and perceiving, by Marianne's letter, how ill she had succeeded in laying any foundation for it, then sat down to write her mother an account of what had passed, and entreat her directions for the future, while Mary Ann, who came into the drawing room on Mrs. Jennings going away, remained fixed at the table where Eleanor wrote, watching the advancement of her pen, grieving over her for the hardship of such a task, and grieving still more fondly over its effect on her mother. In this manner they had continued about a quarter of an hour, when Mary Ann, whose nerves could not then bear any sudden noise, was startled by a rap at the door. "Who can this be?" cried Eleanor. "So early, too. I thought we had been safe." Mary Ann moved to the window. "It's Colonel Brandon," she said with vexation. "We're never safe from him. He will not come in, as Mrs. Jennings is from home." "I will not trust to that," said Mary Ann, retreating to her own room. "A man who has nothing to do with his time has no conscience in his intrusion on that of others." The event proved her conjecture right, though it was founded on injustice and error. For Colonel Brandon did come in, and Eleanor, who was convinced that solicitude for Mary Ann brought him thither, and who saw that solicitude in his disturbed and melancholy look, and in his anxious though brief inquiry after her, could not forgive her sister for esteeming him so lightly. "I met Mrs. Jennings in Bond Street," said he after the first salutation, "and she encouraged me to come on. And I was the more easily encouraged because I thought it probable that I might find you alone, which I was very desirous of doing. My object, my wish, my sole wish, in desiring it, I believe it is to be a means of giving comfort. No, I must not say comfort, not present comfort, but conviction, lasting conviction to your sister's mind. My regard for her, yourself, for your mother, will allow me to prove it by relating some circumstance which nothing but a very sincere regard, nothing but an earnest desire of being useful, I think I'm justified, though where so many hours have been spent in convincing myself that I'm right, is there not some reason to fear I may be wrong?" He stopped. "I understand you," said Eleanor. "You have something to tell me of Mr. Willoughby that will open his character farther. Your telling it will be the greatest act of friendship that can be shown Mary Ann. My gratitude will be ensured immediately by any information tending to that, and hers must be gained by it in time. Pray let me hear it." "Well, you shall, and to be brief, when I quitted Barton last October, but this will give you no idea. I must go further back. You will find me a very awkward narrator, Miss Dashwood. I hardly know where to begin. A short account of myself, I believe, will be necessary, and it shall be a short one. On such a subject," sighing heavily, "can I have little temptation to be diffuse?" He stopped a moment for recollection, and then, with another sigh, went on. "You have probably entirely forgotten a conversation. It's not to be supposed that it could make an impression on you. A conversation between us one evening at Barton Park. It was the evening of a dance in which I alluded to a lady I had once known as resembling, in some measure, your sister Mary Ann." "Indeed," answered Eleanor, "I have not forgotten it." He looked pleased by this remembrance, and added, "If I'm not deceived by the uncertainty, the partiality of a tender recollection, there's a very strong resemblance between them, as well in mind as person. The same warmth of heart, the same eagerness of fancy and spirits. This lady was one of my nearest relations, an orphan from her infancy, and under the guardianship of my father. Our ages were nearly the same, and from our earliest years we were playfellows and friends. And I can't remember the time when I did not love Eliza. And my affection for her as we grew up was, as perhaps, judging from my present forlorn and cheerless gravity, you might think me incapable of having ever felt. Hers, for me, was, I believe, fervent as the attachment of your sister to Mr. Willoughby, and it was, though from a different cause, no less unfortunate. At 17, she was lost to me forever. She was married against her inclination to my brother. Her fortune was large, and our family estate much encumbered, and this, I fear, is all that can be said for the conduct of one who is at once her uncle and guardian. My brother didn't deserve her. He didn't even love her. I had hoped that her regard for me would support her under any difficulty, and for some time it did. But at last the misery of her situation, for she experienced great unkindness, overcame all her resolution, and though she had promised me that nothing, but how blindly I relate. I've never told you how this was brought on. We were within a few hours of eloping together for Scotland. The treachery, or the folly, of my cousin's maid betrayed us. I was banished to the house of a relation far distant, and she was allowed no liberty, no society, no amusement till my father's point was gained. I had depended on her fortitude too far, and the blow was a severe one. But had her marriage been happy, so young as I was then, a few months must have reconciled me to it, or at least I should not have now to lament it. But this, however, was not the case. My brother had no regard for her. His pleasures were not what they ought to have been, and from the first he treated her unkindly. The consequence of this, upon a mind so young, so lively, so inexperienced as Mrs. Brandon's, was but too natural. She resigned herself at first to all the misery of her situation, and happy had it been if she had not lived to overcome those regrets which the remembrance of me occasioned. But can we wonder that with such a husband to provoke inconstancy, and without a friend to advise or restrain her, for my father lived only a few months after their marriage, and I was with my regiment in the East Indies, she should fall? Had I remained in England, perhaps, but I meant to promote the happiness of both by removing from her for years, and for that purpose had procured my exchange. The shock which her marriage had given me, in a voice of great agitation, was of trifling weight, was nothing to what I felt when I heard, about 2 years afterwards, of her divorce. It was that which threw this gloom, even now the recollections of what I suffered. He could say no more, and rising hastily, walked for a few minutes about the room. Eleanor, affected by his relation, and still more by his distress, could not speak. He saw her concern, and coming back to her, took her hand, pressed it, and kissed it with grateful respect. A few minutes more of silent exertion enabled him to proceed with composure. It was nearly 3 years after this unhappy period before I returned to England. My first care, when I did arrive, was, of course, to seek for her, but the search was as fruitless as it was melancholy. I couldn't trace her beyond her first seducer, and there was every reason to fear that she had removed from him only to sink deeper in a life of sin. Her legal allowance was not adequate to her fortune, nor sufficient to her comfortable maintenance, and I learnt from my brother that the power of receiving it had been made over some months before to another person. He imagined, and calmly could he imagine it, that her extravagance and consequent distress had obliged her to dispose of it for some immediate relief. At last, however, and after I had been 6 months in England, I did find her. Regard for a former servant of mine, who had since fallen into misfortune, carried me to visit him in a sponging house where he was confined for debt. And there, the same house, under a similar confinement, was my unfortunate sister, so altered, so faded, worn down by acute suffering of every kind. Hardly could I believe the melancholy and sickly figure before me to be the remains of the lovely, blooming, healthful girl on which I had once doted. What I endured in so beholding her! But I have no right to wound your feelings by attempting to describe it. I've pained you too much already. That she was to all appearances in the last stage of a consumption was, yes, in a situation it was my greatest comfort. Life could do nothing for her, beyond giving time for a better preparation for death, and that was given. I saw her placed in comfortable lodgings and under proper attendance. I visited her every day during the rest of her short life. I was with her in her last moments. Again he stopped to recover himself, and Eleanor spoke her feelings in an exclamation of tender concern at the fate of his unfortunate friend. "Your sister, I hope, cannot be offended," said he, "by the resemblance I have fancied between her and my poor disgraced relation. Their fates, their fortunes, cannot be the same, and had the natural sweet disposition of the one been guarded by a firmer mind, or a happier marriage, she might have been all that you'll live to see the other be. But to what does all this lead? I seem to have been distressing you for nothing. Ah, Miss Dashwood, a subject such as this, untouched for 14 years, it's dangerous to handle it at all. I will be more collected, more concise. She left in my care her only child, a little girl, the offspring of her first guilty connection, and was then about 3 years old. She loved the child, and had always kept it with her. It was valued, a precious trust to me, and gladly would I have discharged it in the strictest sense by watching over her education myself, had the nature of our situations allowed it. But I had no family, no home, and my little Eliza was therefore placed at school. I saw her there whenever I could, and after the death of my brother, which happened about 5 years ago, and which left me the possession of the family property, she visited me at Delaford. I called her a distant relation, but I'm well aware that I have in general been suspected of a much nearer connection with her. It is now 3 years ago, she had just reached her 14th year, that I removed her from school to place her under the care of a very respectable woman residing in Dorsetshire, and had the charge of 4 or 5 other girls of about the same time of life. And for 2 years I had every reason to be pleased with her situation. But last February, almost a 12-month back, she suddenly disappeared. I had allowed her, imprudently, as it turned out, at her earnest desire to go to Bath with one of her young friends who was attending her father there for his health. I knew him to be a very good sort of man, and thought well of his daughter, better than she deserved, for with a most obstinate and ill-judged secrecy she would tell nothing, and would give no clue, though she certainly knew it all. He, her father, a well-meaning but not a quick-sighted man, could really, I believe, give no information, for he had been generally confined to the house while the girls were ranging over the town and making what acquaintance they chose. And he tried to convince me, as thoroughly as he was convinced himself, of his daughter's being entirely unconcerned in the business. In short, I could learn nothing but that she was gone. All the rest, for 8 long months, was left to conjecture. What I thought, what I feared, may be imagined, and what I suffered too. Good heavens, cried Eleanor, could Willoughby— The first news that reached me of her, he continued, came in a letter from herself last October. It was forwarded to me from Delaford, and I received it on the very morning of our intended party to Whitwell, and this was the reason of my leaving Barton so suddenly, which I am sure must at the time have appeared strange to everybody, and which I believe gave offence to some. Little did Mr. Willoughby imagine, I suppose, when his looks censured me for incivility in breaking up the party, that I was called away to the relief of one whom he had made poor and miserable. But had he known it, what would have availed? Would he have been less gay or less happy in the smiles of your sister? No, he had already done that. No, he had already done that which no man can feel for another would do. He had left the girl whose youth and innocence he had seduced in a situation of the utmost distress, with no creditable home, no help, no friends, ignorant of his address. He had left her, promising to return. He neither returned, nor wrote, nor relieved her. This is beyond everything, exclaimed Eleanor. His character is now before you, expensive, dissipated, and worse than both. Knowing all this, as I have now known it many weeks, guess what I must have felt on seeing your sister as fond of him as ever, and on being assured that she was to marry him. Guess what I must have felt for all of your sakes. When I came to you last week and found you alone, I came determined to know the truth, though irresolute what to do when it was known. My behavior must have seemed strange to you then, but now you'll comprehend it. To suffer you all to be so deceived, to see your sister, what could I do? I had no hope of interfering with success, and sometimes I thought your sister's influence might yet reclaim him. But now, after so dishonorable usage, who can tell what his designs were on her? Whatever they may have been, however, she may now and hereafter doubtless will turn with gratitude towards her own condition, when she compares it with that of my poor Eliza, when she considers the wretched and hopeless situation of this poor girl, and pictures her to herself with an affection for him so strong, still as strong as her own, and with a mind tormented by self-reproach, which must attend her through life. Surely this comparison must have its use with her. She will feel her own sufferings to be nothing. They proceed from no misconduct, and can bring no disgrace. On the contrary, every friend must be still more her friend by them. Concern for her happiness and respect for her fortitude under it must strengthen every attachment. Use your own discretion, however, in communicating to her what I've told you. You must know best what'll be its effect. But had I not seriously and from my heart believed it might be of service, might lessen her regrets, I would not have suffered myself to trouble you with this account of my family's afflictions, with a recital which may seem to have been intended to raise myself at the expense of others. Eleanor's thanks followed this speech with grateful earnestness, attended too with the assurance of her expecting material advantage to Marianne from the communication of what had passed. "I have been more pained," said she, "by her endeavors to acquit him than by all the rest, for it irritates her mind more than the most perfect conviction of his unworthiness can do. Now, though at first she'll suffer much, I'm sure she will soon become easier. Have you," she continued after a short silence, "ever seen Mr. Willoughby since you left him at Barton?" "Yes," he said gravely. "Once I have. One meeting was unavoidable." Eleanor, startled by his manner, looked at him anxiously, saying, "What? Have you met him to—" "I could meet him no other way. Eliza had confessed to me, though most reluctantly, the name of her lover, and when he returned to town, which was within a fortnight after myself, we met by appointment, he to defend, I to punish his conduct. We returned unwounded, and the meeting, therefore, never got abroad." Eleanor sighed over the fancied necessity of this, but to a man and a soldier she presumed not to censure it. "Such," said Colonel Brandon after a pause, "has been the unhappy resemblance between the fate of mother and daughter, and so imperfectly have I discharged my trust. Is she still in town?" "No, as soon as she recovered from her lying in, for I found her near delivery, I removed her and her child into the country, and there she remains." Recollecting soon afterwards that he was probably dividing Eleanor from her sister, he put an end to his visit, receiving from her again the same grateful acknowledgments, and leaving her full of compassion and esteem for him.